Hello and welcome to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege. Today is Tuesday, September 17th. Week 2 of the NFL is officially behind us now after last night's game in which the Falcons stole a win in Philadelphia, 22-21. We're going to go over that game and all the crazy hypotheticals and decision-making that went towards the end of that game. Then also, big news from yesterday, Bryce Young officially getting benched by the Carolina Panthers. We'll talk about that. Plus a lot more to go over as well from week 2 later on in the show. So make sure to stay tuned for that. But before we do start, I'd like to remind you guys before we get started, if you got any questions during the show, we want to hear about it. Your input is a big part of what makes this show great, and we thrive on your energy and insights. So whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you want to make it absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's an easy way to go about that by using the new Super Chat feature. Just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box to send in your Super Chat. This way, it guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content you love, and we appreciate every bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit the Super Chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible. And there's also still the alternative tip and donations link if you want to use that. GSMCpodcast.net is the link you could use to comment and leave a question on anything we say on today's show. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support on this channel, and we're always so thankful to you guys whenever you guys get the chance to support us with that new Super Chat button at the bottom of the chat box. But now we can finally get into this madness from last night's game, right? The Falcons and the Eagles, the last game of week 2. The Falcons escaped with a 22-21 victory in Philadelphia. Both teams now stand at 1-1 after the first 2 weeks. Another close game in this week, all throughout, Sunday and even going back, not Thursday. Thursday was a blowout, but Sunday, really, it was all filled with these close games and a lot of good ones as well. Another close game decided by a field goal or less. Another home team losing as well this week. A lot of upsets in that regard. And to just go through a bit of the context through this game, it was 7-6 at halftime. The first half wasn't really filled with too much, explosive plays. I think both teams were still trying to figure each other out. There was a lot of running, good running from Bijan Robinson. I was very impressed by that. And also from the Eagles' part as well, Saquon and their offense looking pretty dominant, but still only 7-6 at halftime. And the game really didn't take that much of an exciting turn until the end of the third quarter when Darnell Mooney scores the first touchdown of the game to make it 15-10 in favor of the Falcons. And then that sort of got the Eagles started a little bit, and ultimately, when we headed into the fourth quarter, Jalen Hurts scores on a tush push after Saquon Barkley was ruled down at the half-yard line. They hit the 2-point conversion as well, making it 18-15 at that point. And then it follows that up with a bunch of just craziness that happened after that. The biggest one was with a minute 46 left, and the Eagles were driving towards the Falcon side of the field, right, to score a touchdown. That drive followed up a big fourth down stop by C.J. Gardner-Johnson. If you guys remember, a fourth down that the Falcons were trying to convert on, C.J. Gardner-Johnson just bursts through the middle and stops Bijan Robinson dead in his tracks there to stop that fourth down from being converted. At that point, you kind of got the feeling that the Falcons sort of gave the game away there by not converting on that, by leaving CJ unblocked to make the tackle. But there was a lot more to happen after that, obviously, right? Like I mentioned before, the Eagles now, after that turnover on downs, were driving down the field with a minute 46 left. Philadelphia faced a third down. I forget how far it was, but it was like a 3rd and 4, 3rd and 3 actually. And third down, little time left. You're only up a field goal. The Philadelphia Eagles decide to throw the ball to Saquon Barkley. If you guys saw it or saw the clip on social media, it was a rollout to Jalen Hurts' right side, a play-action rollout. Saquon Barkley there in the flat, pretty open as I think that play can get. Jalen Hurts throws the ball in a very good spot. There's nothing wrong with that, but just Saquon just drops it. Everything's on the mark, everything's perfect, but Saquon just drops it. As simple as that. And then you're faced with a decision, right? Because you dropped the ball, because you dropped the pass, the time stops. So that's not in your favor. It's already 4th and 4. So Nick Sirianni, Kellen Moore decide to just kick the field goal, make it 21-15 at that point, and give the ball back to the Atlanta Falcons, right? And the Atlanta Falcons, take the ball with about a minute 30 left, I want to say, if I remember correctly. And through the culmination of that game, 2-minute drive, Kirk right down the field. I think he hit on every pass that he threw in that drive, all leading up to the last throw to Drake London, beats Darius Slay on a fake inside move all the way back to the front pylon, and Kirk puts it on the money, and the Atlanta Falcons win with about 20 seconds or something left in the game. They had one more chance, the Eagles did, but Jalen Hurts ended up throwing an interception to Jesse Bates, which really closed the entire deal. So now we look at this and try to dissect everything, right? Because it all happened with a minute 46 left, right? Of course, it wasn't decided with that decision and with those last 2 minutes, right? Because we're talking about an entire football game. So to say that this one play decided it, you could really go back throughout this entire game, different decisions that could have worked in the Eagles' favor, the Falcons' favor, if they decided to, rectify some things. But this was the main part of the game that everybody focuses on, right? Because you look at this play, you look at Saquon talking about it, and how he drops the ball, right? Some people might even say that the Eagles shouldn't have even called that, right? Everyone's saying, or most people I think would say, that the Eagles should have just ran it once, kill some time with it, depending on if they got the first down or not, get a couple yards, make it 4th and short, and then possibly run it again, use the tush push again, or, make another play up. But using that method, you kill time, you get 2 plays instead of 1 now, obviously in hindsight, and you could really put the game away more likely than not if you decide to run it instead of throw it, right? But to me, I had no issue with that play calling to Saquon. He knows he should have caught that. It was a relatively easy throw to him. I have no problem with it. He catches that ball 9 times out of 10 most often, and this one time he just happened to drop it. And again, he is, outside of A.J. Brown, who didn't play, he's probably your most talented player. So a lot of the times in these situations, you want the ball in that best player's hands, and he just dropped it, right? You could just say they should have handed it off to him, right? He'd still get the ball either way, but this is all hindsight, right? Everyone freaks out about it now because it didn't work. If it did work, or if it was 4th and 1, it wouldn't really matter, and I don't think that many people would make a big deal about it, right? They would just say the Eagles won the game. Questionable call, but it worked, so we're not going to talk about it that much. Now that it didn't work, everybody wants to get on the Eagles, the play calling, Nick Sirianni, and I really don't defend Nick Sirianni or Kellen Moore that often, but I didn't think this was a problem at all with how the game ended up. The real problem to me was the fact that the Eagles' defense and the lack of pass rush is really starting to concern me more than I thought it would after last week's game against the Packers, because I know Kirk and the Falcons had a good amount of time with what the Eagles left them right when they kicked that field goal, but there was absolutely no pressure on Kirk. There was no jamming or, getting in the receiver's face to make the catches uncomfortable. Every time a receiver caught the ball, they had about 3 yards at least of space to work with, run out of bounds, and everything was it was just like a practice. It's like they were running a practice and they were going up against the scout team defense where no one's allowed to touch the quarterback or anything like that. It was so easy that you wouldn't have thought that they were playing in Philly, a hostile environment, the team getting into it. Kirk managed that drive as perfectly as you would have liked. Again, practice-like, because everything was so just comfortable for Kirk. He had a bunch of time to go through his progressions and make the throw. Through 2 games now, the Eagles have 3 sacks in 2 games, 0 from Jalen Carter, from Jordan Davis, from Josh Sweat, or Bryce Huff. their starting front line basically has recorded no sacks. The only people that have recorded sacks are Zach Bond, their middle linebacker, and one defensive lineman in the game last night against the Falcons. Their starters have no sacks, and I think that's a real problem. More so than the play not working, I don't really mind that at all. Again, if it works, no one's really talking about it now, and I don't want to hear anything about, having it work or have people saying that they should have just ran it, because Saquon is the guy. You bought him, you paid him a lot of money, bought him off the market to try and get this, whole situation settled at the running back position. So to go with that, to go with this now, Saquon, and, turning on him a little bit, or the play calling as well, I don't really buy that. I like the play call overall. And, Atlanta, I thought they played a way better game than they did week 1 against the Steelers. A lot more play calling, a lot more schemes and motions work under center, keeping this Philadelphia Eagles defense on their toes, not really being affected by the pass rush is another thing. But I really like what the Falcons did. Drake London got more involved. Bijan looked a little bit more comfortable from week 1. And Kirk is slowly getting there. There was those reports recently that said that he wasn't 100% thus far. I think he told Troy Aikman that leading up to that Monday Night Football game. But I like the way that they are slowly developing. This was a big win because next week they have the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Chiefs might look different now, right? With Pacheco, no Hollywood Brown in their lineup, so it could benefit the Falcons a lot more, and they could end up winning that game. I wouldn't be surprised. But if they went 0-2 and then they hosted the Chiefs after that, it could have been a very rough start for them. So this was a big win for them, not only on the results, but how they looked playing. And the Eagles, a bad loss. I wouldn't blame anything on Jalen. I know he threw the interception at the end, and the offense was relatively monotone, but I thought he played better. I thought his decision-making was better, and just really commanding everything. I felt that it was a lot cleaner, but obviously missing A.J. Brown was huge. That helped out a lot for the Falcons, and this could have been easily avoided. One stat I wanted to throw out there to you guys, because I thought it was pretty remarkable, was that since the start of last year in 2023, the Eagles defense has 4 losses, or the whole team has 4 losses with a lead in the final 2 minutes, and they've allowed 140 points in the final 2 minutes over that span of time. To give you a bit of context, the Kansas City Chiefs, in that same time span, another good contending team, they've allowed 28 points in the final 2 minutes of all these games, and compared to the Eagles, that's a major problem. Now, you don't want this to become a habit going forward. It sort of is trending that way, and that all has to do with the play calling there towards the end, and that has to be fixed up, right? Or the defense, in my opinion, has to play better, and I'm not sure where they get that pass rush from now. I mean, Jalen Carter is probably their best, most talented player, but getting rid of Hassan Reddick back in April probably isn't turning out the way that they would have liked right now. Still no sign of Nolan Smith either. They've really hyped him up in the offseason, but up until now, I really haven't seen him, so that's another thing that I'm still looking out for. But yeah, I think a very sour taste for the Eagles and a very relieving feeling, I think, for the Falcons, where in the final 2 minutes, you probably were feeling a little bit nervous that you might lose, but Kirk, the Falcons, get a good drive going, and they end up winning the game. So the Falcons go to 1-1. And sticking in the NFC East now, we'll wrap up this segment, but we'll go on to talk about Bryce Young. Yesterday, before the game started, ESPN reported that Bryce Young was officially being benched by the Carolina Panthers. My thoughts on it, what went into this decision, and, just talking about this whole situation and how bad it's looked on the Carolina Panthers since they drafted Bryce Young. My thoughts and more information on that is coming up right after this break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I
wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some loose shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
We are back now on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to get into our next topic. The biggest news from yesterday outside of the game, obviously, that was played between the Falcons and the Eagles. We had this breaking news that the Carolina Panthers are benching their former number 1 overall pick, Bryce Young, their current quarterback, for veteran Andy Dalton going forward. This is after Sunday's loss to the Los Angeles Chargers. After the Los Angeles Chargers lost, right after that, head coach Dave Canales came out and was asked about the possibility of benching Bryce Young. Kind of random, now that I think about it, that question being asked out of nowhere. I know it's probably a thought, maybe, that you'd want to move on from him, but to be asked about it and then the next day having, the Panthers bench him seems a little bit weird. Too much of a coincidence there. But that's beside the point. He was asked about it, and Dave Canales replied that Bryce Young is our quarterback. That was what he said, which would lead you to believe that they were going to stick with him, obviously, right? But obviously, yesterday, according to ESPN, Dave Canales, General Manager Dan Morgan, Executive Vice President Brant Tillis made the decision altogether to sit down with Bryce Young and decide to bench him, right? So from that point on, you look at Bryce Young and you try to look at the reasonings behind why something like this might happen, right? Outside of what we've seen this year, you go back to last year, and Bryce Young was 2-14 as the starter, 59% completion percentage, 2,877 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions for the rookie being in 2023 out of Alabama. And I think everyone could agree that 2023 was just a bad year for the Panthers in terms of what they had around them, right? It was a bad year, obviously, because of the record, but I don't think they were anywhere near, being prepared at all to have a rookie quarterback starting. It was a bad situation all around. Then you had Frank Reich being fired, and the offensive line was terrible. They only really had Adam Thielen, which was exciting for the first couple of weeks, but then, that died off pretty quickly, and then you had bad games, bad results from that point on. And this offseason, I felt pretty optimistic with what they were doing. They improved the offensive line, bringing in a couple new guys, and Robert Hunt, Damian Lewis from the Seattle Seahawks on that line. They traded for Deontay Johnson. So, there was a little bit something there. It's not so dynamic that it was going to change the entire trajectory of this organization, but it was better than what they were working with last year, in my opinion. But really, through these first 2 games, it hasn't looked at all better than it did last year. If anything, it might have looked worse just from the individual standpoint looking at Bryce Young, because in 2 games, Bryce has lowered his completion percentage at 55%. He only has 245 yards, 3 interceptions, and no passing touchdowns. And it has just really been a struggle individually for Bryce. This is the only criticism I'll really throw at him, because there has been some missed throws, some situations where he might be holding the ball too long and just taking unnecessary sacks that just frustrate a lot of fans and a lot of people looking at Bryce's game, where I feel like a lot of people talking about Bryce, trying to put a lot of criticism on him for playing bad, I feel just don't understand how this situation still isn't that much better. I know I just talked about the improvements that they've made, but foundationally, from start to finish, from the development standpoint, from the entire process of bringing in a first overall pick quarterback, I don't think it's been handled at all anywhere near the minimum requirement that is needed to kind of have a quarterback at least look serviceable for you as the, face of your franchise, right? But Dave Canales also said, going forward that Andy Dalton right now gives them the best chance to win right now at 0-2, with the next few games being at the Las Vegas Raiders, this week coming up. Then they host the Cincinnati Bengals, a reunion there for Andy Dalton and the Bengals. Then they travel to Chicago and host the Atlanta Falcons right after that. So not the hardest of schedules, but overall at 0-2, I feel like this was a panic move a little bit by the Panthers and Dave Canales a little bit, and I'll explain that a little bit more going forward. But if we go back to 2023 when Bryce Young was going to be drafted by the Panthers, and he was the consensus number 1 overall pick, it seems, right? Because the Panthers traded a ton to the Chicago Bears to get that pick because they really liked Bryce. And I think people loved Bryce at that moment, coming out of Alabama, but he wasn't the biggest, tallest guy in that draft class, right? And that was a concern to some people, but I think that was something you could have worked around. And if anything, it put more of an emphasis on surrounding Bryce with the necessary pieces that he needed so he's not taking big hits, so there's not always pressure in his face and having him make bad decisions, right? But none of that happened. None of that happened for the Carolina Panthers, and he started right away for them. And if I could go back, he wouldn't have even looked at the field. I probably would have made him inactive for every game of that year because of how bad the Panthers were, right? There was no good reason why Bryce should have been starting at all last year. I mentioned the improvements this year, and they're still not great, considerably bad, but last year they were even worse, really bad in terms of support around Bryce, roster building, and all that stuff. I don't think anybody could name a wide receiver outside of Adam Thielen, who was obviously their number 1, but at this point in his career, that should be the last thing he should be doing, being any quarterback's number 1. No offense to him, but it doesn't really mix at this point in his career to be a number 1 receiver. I think, he's just past that, especially for a young quarterback to come in and have to work with that, plus a bad offensive line. It's not something that would have worked out, and I think anybody could have told you that if you laid out all the facts. There's no way Bryce should have been starting last year, and then you fire Frank Reich, and now you start everything again this year. You bring a new quarterback coach, a new offensive coordinator, a new head coach, and Bryce now has to learn everything over again, and still, coming off of the back of last year, nothing really went too well for him, outside of the fact, I guess, that you got some experience, but the fact that now you're learning from a whole new voice, a whole new system, and learning new verbiage, new schemes, and how to work out of certain situations, how does it affect the defense and things like that. It's a lot. It's basically like starting over and like he's a rookie all over again, but still he's not progressing mentally from this point on, and it's like, again, having a rookie quarterback in there again. So a lot of that has to do, and I think, in my opinion, falls on the organization just mismanaging everything, coming off of a bad year last year on the field, probably a lot on his plate mentally as well, having to learn all these new things all over again, and now you end up benching him because the results aren't there. I think that's not fair to Bryce Young at this point, and in a way it's almost thrown out this narrative now that he's almost painted as the bad guy, and I think a lot of people would just run with that because they see the stats, they see that he's a starting quarterback, and the Panthers are nowhere near relevant or good whatsoever, so it must be the quarterback, right? The quarterback must stink. He was drafted number 1 overall, and he looks this bad. It's never the organization's fault, right, for a lot of people, but if you really look at it, now, going into this decision, I don't know how you, in any world, you go back to Bryce Young after this. Maybe this could be the end of him in Carolina. I've heard a lot of people say that. But if that's the case, you're sort of setting yourself back like 4 or 5 years now. You're going to have the first overall pick again, so I guess that could benefit you. But still, the way that you gave up so much for Bryce and now to kind of give up on him so early, I saw the stat that he's the earliest number 1 overall pick to get benched in his career, and I just don't feel like he's gotten a fair shot at this whatsoever. He should have been really learning behind somebody. I'm not sure if Andy Dalton was the backup last year, but I probably would have rolled with Andy Dalton for the majority of that time. And then if Bryce, for some reason, looked pretty good or looked better over the practices, after having failed in practice, going through all the turbulation and, bad habits in practice, then maybe you would have started him. But to just throw him out there because Frank Reich and that regime of coaching wanted him and wanted him to start. Obviously, they were planning long term, but that wasn't the case. They got fired, and now you have Dave Canales coming in, and this is the point I was alluding to before. With Dave Canales coming in, you don't really have that connection to this quarterback because you didn't draft him. You necessarily didn't want him in as your quarterback. I'm sure they have no problem with him. That's not what I'm trying to say. But with Bryce being there, Dave Canales, I don't think has that emotional relationship yet with Bryce Young where this could be a situation where he feels like he needs to have him as his starting quarterback. I think it's easier now to move on from him because he never drafted him. So that, on top of the fact that I think Dave Canales also, I think it's reality to say that he's also thinking about his job. Looking at the situation at 0-2, you're trying to win games as the head coach, and if you feel like Bryce doesn't help that and doesn't aid in that, progress, you're going to bench him, again, because you don't really have that connection by drafting him like Frank Reich and the old coaching staff did. So I feel like this is also a bit of him trying to save his job, trying to improve or show some life here with a new quarterback in Andy Dalton. And right now, I don't know what happens if the Panthers do look better and, they win a couple games here or there. What happens with Bryce Young then? What sort of return are they going to get for him if they try to trade him or something like that? I don't know, again, if he ever plays for the Panthers. Definitely this year. I feel like that would just make this even more of a mess. I don't like the idea of benching him right now. He does look like a broken quarterback. I will admit that. He looks like his confidence is just shot. But it's hard. It's hard to come to a resolution because, he is just not looking good right now. He hasn't progressed. But in the same breath, you can't do too much because the Panthers have just mismanaged this, in my opinion. So now this has all almost been for nothing, right? If that makes sense. Bryce, trying to restart this whole thing with him is going to be extremely difficult. And if you move on, you're going to have to really learn from this experience if and when you get another quarterback potentially, and try to learn from this, support them with more weapons, more support, because this has just not really been anything near to like you compare to CJ Stroud or even Anthony Richardson this year with Caleb Williams. Nothing has been comparable to this situation with the Panthers, and I don't think any of those quarterbacks would have been any more successful than Bryce Young was and is currently with the Panthers. So that's where that stands. The Panthers have made this decision now. It's hard to come back from it, and I'd like to know what you guys think about this. Do you think this was a right decision to bench Bryce Young? Do you think it was too quick of a decision now to make for the Panthers? I feel like they could have given him a week or two more, but, it is what it is now. Dave Canales and the Panthers feel like this was the best option for them, but I feel like it almost is a situation where you make it and it's no going back. There's no turning back from this situation if you're trying to go back to Bryce Young. So it is something that they'll have to live with. The Panthers trying to dig themselves out of this hole that they find themselves in at 0-2, but it feels like a lot worse now, obviously, with how they're playing. So that'll be that segment. We'll end that on that note, but we'll continue on with some more segments on today's show, going from Bryce Young and the Panthers quarterback situation to now the Steelers. They get another win. Justin Fields gets another win as the starting quarterback. Have we seen enough from Fields at this point to officially name him the starter? We'll talk about that and how we feel on that regard when we return right after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Back here now on the show to talk about some more quarterback news around the NFL, this time sticking back to Pittsburgh and talking about Justin Fields and where we stand on this situation, right? Because week 2 of the Justin Fields experience had the same result as week 1. The Steelers go to 2-0 after a 13-6 win over the Denver Broncos, and Pittsburgh in this game scored their first touchdown of the season, right? Justin Fields threw that touchdown, back shoulder throw, nice placement and nice, execution from the Steelers to Darnell Washington, and now somehow scored less points. Even though they scored a touchdown, they scored less points than they did in week 1. Fields, in that game against the Denver Broncos, finished 13 of 20 for 117 yards and 1 touchdown. It looks pretty pedestrian if you're just looking straight at the numbers, right? You're thinking, all right, he had a decent game. Not too much improvement there from the first one, right? But if you watch the game, I thought that he looked a lot more settled in, a lot more in control of this offense from what I saw in week 1, because week 1 it was all coming so fast. Was Russ going to play? Was he not going to play? And then once it was official that he was going to be out, Justin trying to adjust some of the game plan, trying to make it as conservative or as safe to have Justin be successful, and also in that same breath going out and trying to get a win on the road, and they got both of them. So now in this game, I feel like with a whole week's worth of practice, they were able to go in there, execute some of the game plan, and mold it more so to Justin Fields' skill set. And there were definitely moments where the stat line, just for what it's worth, could have looked a lot better, and the Steelers could have potentially put up more points if it wasn't for some of these misplays because of a lot of penalties that the Steelers continue to have through 2 weeks. There was one situation where George Pickens scored a touchdown, but it was ruled off because of offensive pass interference. They settled for a field goal, right? That's one. Another deep throw to George Pickens over Pat Surtain on the right sideline. Again, it was completed, but it was ruled off because of a holding call on the Steelers' offensive line. And that throw, if you haven't seen it yet, beautiful placement for a quarterback to throw it on the run over the shoulder of George Pickens and just have it fall perfectly. It was as good as it got, I think, from Justin Fields. Arguably one of the best throws I've seen him make for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but it was all for naught because it was just ruled off because of some sloppy play from the offensive line. So that's 2 plays now where you at least could have gotten 10 points, right? If George scores that touchdown and you get into field goal position off of this deep throw to George Pickens as well, you could have scored 10 more points. So the Steelers could have had, based on how everything else went, 23, 25 points just from those 2 games. And there was also another play, a deep throw again to George Pickens that was incomplete because of a pass interference call on Pat Surtain. I'm almost certain that led to another field goal. And in hindsight and everything, if all of these are completed, or at least 2 more of these, Justin has thrown for 2 touchdowns and probably has like 200 or something yards, right? And it looks a bit better. But I think more so than not, the Steelers just have to fix some of their other problems and not just, it's not like it's just all Justin Fields and he's like holding them back or anything like that. I think he's the one that from week 1 to week 2 has gotten progressively better and progressively cleaner in some of these plays, whereas the Steelers' offensive line and some of the production from the wide receivers did go up a bit more. We saw a bit of Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin making a couple plays, Pat Freiermuth also getting involved. The running backs did their thing, but the offensive line, I think, was a lot sloppier and a bit all over the place from week 1 to week 2. And just some of my thoughts on that even more. it was just self-inflicting plays that, like Mike Tomlin, I think, mentioned today at his press conference, that it just kills any sort of momentum that you have, right? If you're trying to incorporate this quarterback here, this quarterback, Justin Fields, and that, you can't have plays that your own team just sort of, ruins everything in a sense, right? For lack of better terms. This is a moment where, Justin, you're trying to be as perfect as possible, right? You're not going to avoid every single mistake, but to have, I think in one drive in the second quarter, I believe, where they had those holding calls, I think it was a couple holding calls that they had on that drive, and Najee Harris even mentioned it after the game as well. They need to just stop getting in their own way, because they are not. A lot of people mention the play calling and some of the choices that the Steelers make on where they decide to throw it, targeting the outsides of the field rather than the middle of the field. But I thought Najee Harris made a great point where he mentioned how these self-inflicting problems that they keep getting themselves in trouble with, a lot of the times they just limit the amount of plays or which type of plays they can call, because they are no longer in rhythm. They are no longer in the part of the game plan where they're able to throw some of these plays, right? They have to be more conservative, throw it outside the numbers, and just run right up the middle, just try and gain some of that yardage back, and you're set back so far. And I think that ruins it a lot of the times, and how the Steelers might look so, boring, pedestrian, not explosive. A lot of that just has to do with them, and if they could get out of their own way, this offense could really look a bit more efficient, which is a place that a lot of people, Steelers fans, would like it to be at, and I think Arthur Smith has helped with that, but it's really the self-inflicting wounds that really hold the Steelers back in these first two games. And on those self-inflicting wounds, talking about decisions that, hinder your ability to win rather than help you, I've never even heard of a situation where you rotate offensive linemen in, like we're talking about a scrimmage or a practice. That's what the Steelers did, if anybody wasn't aware. If anybody watched the game, the right tackle, last week it was Broderick Jones who started at right tackle, right? Their first round pick this year, Troy Fautanu, was not able to play in week 1, so they started Broderick Jones. Because they started Broderick Jones, now this week, Troy Fautanu, their first round rookie, was coming back. He did practice, but Mike Tomlin said today that he was still a little bit unsure of how, that knee would hold up, how healthy he would look, and, all those sort of things, right? So they decided this brilliant idea, right, to rotate at the right tackle position, which, again, it makes no sense to me. We're talking about the regular season here, right? We're talking about every win matters, every play matters. You can't have these negative plays. And when you rotate offensive linemen, again, I've never even seen something like that in the regular season. Practice, scrimmages, preseason, that is all fine. It doesn't matter. But in the regular season, to have a guy come in for a drive or two and then sub him out, I think that's a risk you can't take at this point, because you mess up the entire flow of that offensive line. One guy doesn't do what the other guy does well, or vice versa, and that's what happened, because Troy Fautanu, as much as he could have been hurt, and still not 100%, he played pretty well, whereas Broderick Jones came in and he was rotated in, and he had, I think, 3 or 2 holding penalties that really set the offense back. And you're sort of stuck in these decisions that you make because you decide to rotate these offensive linemen in, and it just doesn't work out. And I think anybody could have told the Steelers that from the start, that rotating offensive linemen in is it's not even a thing, I don't even think, again, outside of preseason or anything like that. If you were scared of Troy getting hurt, Fautanu getting hurt, don't play him. Just start Broderick Jones. Maybe he wasn't convincing in the first week, but I think it was worse, and it looked worse because of the fact that you were indecisive in trying to do that, and it hurt the offense, in my opinion. So that's one thing. But also, because the Steelers have a very good defense, I think they've gone by as well pretty much unscathed from these first 2 games. They made it very hard for Bo Nix to really get anything going in the first half, or just overall. Bo Nix finished with 246 yards and 2 interceptions, and that big one was in the red zone, throwing that interception to Corey Trice. But the Steelers, again, feel like their defense is keeping them in these games, and we're going to have a better look at them next week, or this upcoming week, I should say, when they face the Los Angeles Chargers, because that's going to be an ugly, run-heavy, probably low-scoring as well kind of game, where the Steelers are definitely going to be tested more. Their defensive line, their linebackers, the entire defense is going to be tested more in how they stop the run and the plays that follow subsequently after that, because the Chargers have been looking good. They're definitely better than the Broncos. I don't know if they're better than the Falcons, but they've surprised a lot of people with how they've played. And just going forward on Fields and wrapping this all up with him, my final thoughts on him, I think it's just now that you're 2-0 with him, that he's looking more comfortable, and I expect him to look better next week against the Chargers as well. And if he somehow wins that game, if the Steelers pull it off and say they score maybe 2 touchdowns now this week, I think that's pretty much a decision made for you, right? I know Mike Tomlin keeps saying that he doesn't want to live in the hypotheticals, that it doesn't really make sense to do that, but there's going to come a point, and I'm sure he's waiting for that moment, when Russ is healthy. With the way Justin is playing right now, I think this is just leading to a road, to an end result where if he's 3-0 and Russ comes back, I don't know how you just tell Justin, like, sorry, your work is great, but we're going to start Russ anyway, right? That's not fair, and that's a good way to divide the locker room, in my opinion, right? If Justin's winning these games and you just throw Russ back in there, there's going to be some dividing thoughts in there, and that's the last thing you want, again, for this Steelers team, that their offense isn't a juggernaut, isn't explosive, right? Everything is so just kind of pieced together, and they're just getting by. I don't think you touch it whatsoever. That's my opinion. I've been pretty convinced with Justin Fields, right? I feel like he's gaining more confidence as the games go on, and I'd like to see him, just keep getting better rather than throwing a wrench in the whole thing and creating more problems for you, unnecessary problems at that. But we'll see how that goes. Hopefully the Steelers get to 3-0 this week in their first home game, hosting the Los Angeles Chargers. But that is all from the news point of things. We're going to recap a little bit more now with the next couple of segments, looking at first which 2-0 teams have surprised us the most through these first 2 games. I have a top 5 of the most surprising 2-0 teams, and then in the second segment after that, we're going to look at the top 5 0-2 teams that I feel like are worrying me the most at this point in the season. Those 2 segments are coming up in just a few seconds. We'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Jumping back into the action now, quickly here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, I thought it would be a good idea to look at some of the teams that I have been most surprised with already through the first 2 weeks. Which 2-0 teams have been the most surprising thus far to me? There's a couple of teams here that I could have chosen from, but I decided to limit it down to the top 5 most surprising teams, the teams that have impressed me the most at this point of the season. Before I get into number 5 and work my way up to number 1, I wanted to mention some honorable mentions here. One of them being the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think a lot of change, a lot of good defensive play, but so far through the first 2 weeks, I think being 2-0 has a lot to do with their schedule. Not everybody has the benefit of playing the Broncos with a rookie quarterback thus far yet. They're a decent opponent, but I think there are definitely other teams on here that have had better, more impressive wins. So with that being the case now, the other honorable mention I also wanted to mention was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because again, their schedule has one impressive win on it, right? Obviously the win this past week against the Lions, but overall, the first week against the Commanders, I feel like could have been a different, opponent, could have led to a different result. So with that being the case, those two are my 2 honorable mentions. And now with that out of the way, we can get into the top 5. And starting off with the 5th team on my list, the team that has been impressive but not number 1, obviously, to me has to be the Seattle Seahawks, because I've been impressed thus far with both sides of the ball and different aspects of their team offensively specifically, because with a new head coach, with the Seahawks being relatively average over the last 2 years, being 9-8 and not really getting that much better. This was a tricky situation, I think, for new head coach Mike Macdonald to come into and really make an impact right off the bat, but that's exactly what he's done so far, right? Because they got here with a win over Denver and New England as their 2 opponents, and, not the most impressive wins, but I think where the Steelers are compared to Seahawks and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I think those 2 teams, the Steelers and the Bucs, are better teams overall, whereas the Seahawks, I think, are closer to the Broncos and the Patriots. That's why I had to include them on my list. They showed a great running game, like I mentioned before. One aspect of their offense that I didn't expect to be that dominant right off the bat. It was very dominant. It was the reason why they won in week 1 after a great performance by Kenneth Walker, that offensive line as well. They ran all over the Broncos and beat them 26-20, if I'm not mistaken. And then this past week, it was another great performance offensively, but from the passing side of that offense, right? Geno Smith played very well in this game. I think he had over 300 yards or something like that passing. DK Metcalf had a big game. Jackson Smith and Jigba had another big game as well to complement each other. So that was right off of the bat what I noticed just through those first 2 games, right? They were able to beat teams with the run and beat teams with the pass. And from that point on, now getting an overtime win, I think, is huge for this team, to continue being 2-0, especially in that division, right? Because you look at the teams that they're dealing with overall, and you look at the 49ers, who were upset a little bit, I guess you could say, against the Vikings. That's one thing. And then, the Cardinals looking very impressive. They arguably could have been on here, but they're not 2-0 because they lost to the Bills. And, elsewhere, the Rams are surprising because they're 0-2. So this is a great opportunity for the Seahawks to continue this on. Their next game coming up after this is with the Miami Dolphins, and then they travel to Detroit to play the Lions. So those will be good matchups. I know the Dolphins don't have Tua, but once they get to that Lions game, it'll be a good litmus test to see where they're at right now. Then that is only the number 5 team. The number 4 team on this list for me had to be the Los Angeles Chargers. We touched on them briefly in that last segment with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Their capability to adapt to this new, right from the start, from week 1, they ran all over the Las Vegas Raiders. J.K. Dobbins having a monster day at that. And then in the second game, again, not everybody has the luck, the fortune, you could say, of playing the Panthers, and I guess you could say the Raiders a little bit, just because in the first week they didn't look anywhere near where they were in week 2, so they were able to jump on the Raiders early on in week 1. Then in week 2 against the Panthers, they ran all over them as well. At least 131 rushing yards in both of these games for the Chargers, and specifically for J.K. Dobbins, right? So I think that speaks volumes to me right away. 2 comfortable wins already. Focusing on the run very heavily, and it's working. It's one thing to focus on it, right, and say that you want this to be your identity, but for it to work so early on and the way it has already, I think it's great. Now, J.K. Dobbins has had those injury problems, so I'm really hoping that he stays healthy, because I really like him. I love the fit with him being in Los Angeles, so if he could stay like this, I think it'll be huge for them as well. They've ran the ball 56 times already between J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards as well, so I think that even more fills me with some confidence that this is really something that they want to be identified with. And these 2 wins have been huge. If you're going to be a good team, beating teams like the Panthers, beating teams like the Chargers very comfortably like this is what good teams do. At the end of the day, they handle their business very comfortably if they are to that level. And I've liked how the Chargers have done that overall. They're not asking Justin Herbert to do too much with some of their wide receivers. Lad McConkey has had a decent game. Quinn Johnson had a better game in week 2. So limiting those wide receivers and not having to depend on them, I think suits them very well. And their defense is doing good enough, right? As much as we praise the Steelers and their defense doing very good, kind of keeping them in games, I think the Chargers defense as well is complementing their offense with how much they run the ball, how good they are at it, and then just coming up with timely defensive stops as well. I'm still waiting for better opposition. That's why I'm anticipating the Steelers game to be better, but so far so good for the Chargers. I've been impressed with them and dealing with all of the new elements that they've had to so far this year. But they're not number 3. They're not number 3 because I think the Buffalo Bills are and could have been higher on this list, but I kept them at number 3 just because, through the loss of Stephon Diggs, a lot of the defense also, moving on in free agency or just being injured as well. They've been depleted with injuries. Still, they put on very dominant performances from the offensive standpoint at least, right? They were very good in the run game against the Dolphins, and also you go back to that Arizona Cardinals game, Josh Allen turned the superpowers on, right? He became Superman, was involved in 4 touchdowns for this Bills team, and they mounted a comeback against the Cardinals. And I think arguably, out of all these teams I have on here, the Bills have, based on who they are, their reputation thus far in the league, and their recent success, I put them at number 3 because they are still relatively considered a decent team because they have Josh Allen, right? Having that type of quarterback elevates you above other teams. So I had to keep him at number 3 for this point, and because their defense still, they played great against the Dolphins, but against the Cardinals, it didn't look so hot, right? They arguably could have lost that game. So from that standpoint on, I'm still holding on. A little bit of doubt, I guess you could say, for this team, but still very impressed with what I've seen from them offensively. The idea of staying true to that running game, staying true to that identity from Joe Brady, and, still having Josh Allen make all of these throws, still being effective with Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, and those guys like that, Keon Coleman as well, James Cook. I like the fact that they stuck to this game plan and are really executing on it. So the Bills, to me, are very impressive from that standpoint. Pretty surprised with them at 2-0. I felt like they could have struggled some more with the pieces that they've lost, but I was wrong. Then at number 2, we have the Minnesota Vikings, right? The Minnesota Vikings having Sam Darnold steal the show over the first 2 weeks. They've been very impressive overall. Again, where this could have been a situation where having Sam Darnold could have been a negative for them, could have potentially held them back. Sam Darnold has been nothing short of exceptional for them, doing everything right, conducting that offense at a very good pace, at a very good level, and they just had a statement win against the San Francisco 49ers, right? That win was enough of a surprise to me to include them in this list and be one of the top 2 teams that I certainly didn't expect to be 2-0, and not only be 2-0, but the way that they got to 2-0, like I said, beating the 49ers and in week 1, taking care of a worse-off Giants roster, I think speaks volumes to me, and being led by Sam Darnold. I think that defense also, with the additions of Stephon Gilmore, they've recorded 11 sacks in 2 weeks as well. It's very good. They run the ball very well with Aaron Jones as well, and Ty Chandler looks pretty solid as well. But the biggest thing of all, I think now people are starting to realize that head coach Kevin O'Connell is pulling the strings so perfectly, and he could be included in that conversation with the Kyle Shanahans, the Sean McVays, and all these brilliant play callers, right? Kevin O'Connell hasn't been talked about, I think, as much in that regard. And it's a miracle that they won games last year with 3 different starting quarterbacks. Now that he has a pretty good one in Sam Darnold, I like their chances of going forward. I've been impressed with them so far, but they're not number 1. They're not number 1 because I think this one was a pretty obvious one. The New Orleans Saints, to me, are at a left field type of surprising so far this year because they're 2-0. They've scored 91 points through their first 2 games, touchdowns on their first 15 or 14 drives to start this year is remarkably exceptional, right? I'm throwing all the adjectives out there at them because it's all thanks, I think, in my opinion, to Clint Kubiak as their new offensive coordinator. Just has them looking like a completely different team because they didn't really add much, if anything, at all to this offense. You know, Kamara's still there, Olave's still there, Raheed Shaheed is still there, Derek Carr's still their quarterback, and where in a situation where they could have declined, possibly become very boring and monotone, they increased tremendously. And on the offensive side of the ball, like I said, they look unrecognizable from a year ago. Their passing game is working very well. And not only that, I think it's working off the run game exceptionally well. And that's where you see the next level play calling, right? Because you see the run game working, right? But you're just not throwing in there some random pass plays that you think are going to work. It's all based off of the run and how you deceive opposing defenses, right? Showing them similar looks, similar heavy sets, but running different plays off of that really takes this offense to a whole new level. And I wasn't expecting this at all. Like I said, I knew their defense was pretty solid, but their offense to put up this many points, again, albeit against the Panthers, but to go into Dallas and beat them like they did, I think it sent a message. And now next week they will host the Philadelphia Eagles. That'll be a very good test for them. But the way that they're rolling, I don't think they should be that heavy of underdogs against the Eagles, if at all. I'll be interested to see those lines. But that is the list that I made up. Those are the most surprising 2-0 teams, in my opinion, thus far. But we're going to get to the other side of that, right? 0-2 teams. Which 0-2 teams have been the most worrying to me at this point in the season? I'll give you my top 5 in that regard when we return in just a few seconds. Thank you for joining me here on the last segment of today's show. We just finished talking about the most surprising and impressive 2-0 teams in the last segment, and now we're going to go to the other side of that and talk about the most surprising, I guess you could say, and most worrisome 0-2 teams at this point in the year. I have a top 5 list of the teams that I'm most worried about right now, standing at 2-0. Like I did in the previous segment, a honorable mention here to me is only one team, and I have the Cincinnati Bengals as my only honorable mention here. They didn't make the top 5 list of me being very worried about them because I thought that I did see some improvement from week 1 to week 2, and also I think their schedule, if I'm not mistaken, gets pretty easy, leading into these next couple of weeks. They have some very favorable opponents that they should get back to at least 500, and with those improvements, with T. Higgins coming back, I feel like they're going to be all right. It's not a situation where I'm not sure if they're going to get better, so they're my honorable mention to me, and I couldn't put them in the top 5, and especially at the number 5 spot, because that's where I have the Baltimore Ravens, a fellow AFC North team. I'm more worried about them than I am worried about the Bengals, because not only do the Bengals have an easier schedule, the Ravens, I think, have the second hardest schedule in the NFL, only second to the Cleveland Browns. And because of that point on, I feel like it is worrisome to have them on this list, but they're number 5 because they have the best team, I believe, out of the rest of these teams that I'm going to mention. So my level of worry compared to these other teams isn't that bad, but still, what I've seen from the Ravens thus far and projections going forward has me a little bit worried, right? Because they have a talented offense, but we just need to see them use all of these tools and know when to use them and how to get the best out of everybody in this very talented offense, right? Because now you have Isaiah Likely, Mark Andrews, obviously Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson, Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman could be a guy for them. They have a lot of pieces that they could use and very much fit into this run-heavy offense, but I still think that knowing when to use Isaiah Likely, when to go to Mark Andrews, especially when to go to Derrick Henry, at what points you use him, and how do you get even more out of Isaiah Likely based on how good Derrick Henry is? How much does Derrick Henry benefit off of Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews always being in the lineup, right? All of those things, getting everything to be cohesive and work hand in hand with one another, I think that's where they're faltering right now. And it looks worrying because you just gave up a lead to the Las Vegas Raiders, right? You looked pretty well against the Chiefs there in the first game. So off of that performance, you thought you were going to get improvement and win in week 2, but that wasn't the case. So my idea with that, with these Ravens and the idea of them going on, is that I am worried, but they do have a very solid team from that standpoint on. So for me, I wouldn't be surprised if they rectified everything in this next game, but I also wouldn't be surprised if we see more of the same and they could potentially fall to 0-3. So that's the start of my list, right, at the number 5 spot. But at number 4, I have the Tennessee Titans. And similarly to the Ravens, these two positions could have interchanged pretty easily, but I think it all just comes down to Will Levis, and I have them ahead of the Baltimore Ravens. A bit more worried about them because the quarterback position is everything, right? They have everything, on their shoulders. A lot of the success depends on them, and Will Levis is such a curious case because his decision-making definitely needs improvement, right? There's no reason why he should be making those costly turnovers like he did against the Jets and also the Chicago Bears, right? Those are very bad, unacceptable decisions, right, as the starting quarterback. You saw Brian Callahan get into him and how mad he was, I think rightly so. But in certain moments also where I think everything is drawn up as it should, everything is playing out as it should for Will Levis, he makes some pretty good throws. He flows very well with this offense overall, and I think that point, I like the Titans. I've seen some good out of them from that regard. So if Will Levis can just clean up some of these, just awful turnovers, right, which is something that seems easy not to do, right, to not throw it backwards when you're halfway down to the ground or just chuck it up unknowing where the ball is going to end up. I feel like that's all rectifiable and something that could be just fixed pretty simply, right, because everything else more complex, I think, is working for them. So the Titans, if they can figure that out, they have a good team. They should have won in that Bears game, and they also should have at least made it closer with the Jets. They arguably could have won that game as well. So that's why I'm a bit worried about them, just because we're talking about the quarterback. But very simply, they could turn things around if Will Levis can just stop making these boneheaded decisions, and we could see more of the Will Levis that makes the deep throws to Calvin Ridley, right? Throws these nice balls down the field where it could all work out well for them. They're still in a spot where, not all is lost, but I need to see an improvement now because this is back-to-back weeks where he has directly cost them the game. I need to see an improvement next week to really, hone in on the Titans because 0-3 is not where you want to be in the AFC overall. So they're my number 4 team, and then moving on to number 3 is very weird with how these selections play out, right? It's like I'm targeting the AFC South, but I swear that's not the case, but this is where the Colts fall to me because they're number 3 in my opinion because my fears with this team have sort of, come to fruition here a little bit because I feared that the inconsistency or the lack of starting experience from Anthony Richardson last year with this unit, with just overall in his first year in the NFL. I thought that could have come to light in the second year, because you really need to go out there and make mistakes, learn what works or what doesn't work, going up against grown men in these defenses, right? I felt like this year we could have seen those mistakes where we could have saw them in the first year now starting to pop up, and where you get the highest of highs sometimes in the game against the Houston Texans. But just this past week, going toe-to-toe with Malik Willis, who, no shade to him, just got to the Packers and probably should not have been in this game as much as they were. They end up winning that game in large part because Anthony Richardson doesn't play too well. And as much as I want to point the fact out of Anthony Richardson and the inconsistency that you see from him, this run defense for the Colts has not been very well at all. It's a major concern because they've allowed 159 rushing yards to Joe Mixon, and they were somehow able to be within 2 points of the Texans in that game, right? If Anthony Richardson is making these crazy throws, they're able to stay in games. But when Anthony Richardson is not to that level that we saw in week one, showing that inconsistency, they put up 6 points, and the run defense gets gashed again for 151 rushing yards to Josh Jacobs. So that all culminated into this idea with the Colts. Their pass catching options haven't been great. I need to see more out of Michael Pittman. He just got a contract, so I need to see more out of him. Alec Pierce is looking like the best receiver out of the whole bunch, and he was at a threat to not even start as a starting receiver. So I need to see more of Michael Pittman. I need to see more out of A.D. Mitchell to kind of help out Anthony Richardson, but he also has to do his part as well. But it isn't top two, because top two to me, another AFC South team, right? Every team in that division except the Texans is 0-2. So I guess it's not too surprising. But for the Jaguars, this offense isn't producing enough for an okay defense to be out there, right? This offense needs to be tremendously better for this defense that is missing their top cornerback, for Darnell Savage, who missed this game as well. Their defensive line is good, but in the back end, when they come up against a good offensive line and that pass rush isn't hitting, it becomes a bit of a struggle, right? And this offense, I think, isn't capable right now to kind of be in a shootout or score more than 20 points consistently, especially with the loss of Calvin Ridley. That hurts a lot, and trying to replace him with a first-year rookie. I really like Brian Thomas, but to put him in this position of having this much responsibility, I don't think that's effective right now, and they're sort of suffering from that. There's not enough also from the running game to alleviate some of the coverage, some of the pressure on some of these guys like Gabe Davis or Brian Thomas or Evan Ingram as well. I need to see more out of the running game, and it's also just more pressure also on Trevor Lawrence to, just naturally, because of who he is, because of the contract that he got, to perform better. I think that adds a bit more of weight on the amount of worry I have for the Jaguars, because they've invested a lot in Trevor already, right? He's going to be their future for the next couple of years, and how that decision pans out is going to be a big decider in how people look at this Jaguars team, how they evaluate it, and if, they're losing games, not putting up a bunch of points, a lot of the criticism will fall on Trevor Lawrence. So they're second, I guess everyone's second in the AFC South right now, being all 0-2, but second place is still up for grabs. It's not like you're trailing behind every team. You're the only team at 0-2 in that division. You're fortunate that the Texans are the only 2-0 team. So second place in that division is still up for grabs. They're not too far behind. They have an opportunity, at least right now, to kind of rectify it. But it's looking pretty challenging right now for the Jaguars. That's why they are number 2. But at number 1, I have the Los Angeles Rams, because of the injuries really just derailing this exciting year that I thought we were going to see from the Rams. Their entire O-line pretty much is brand new because of the injury to the starters, an injury to some of the backups as well. And not having your offensive line there is one thing, right? It's almost everything, right, for a lot of teams. But you had Puka Nacua get hurt in week 1, which obviously is a major blow. And now this past week, you had Cooper Kupp get injured as well, and he's expected to miss a bunch of weeks, multiple weeks as well. So that's nowhere where you want it to be. The Rams now have no weapons for Matthew Stafford, and no running game really, because that offensive line is just interchanging. Some people are healthy, some aren't, and it's not a winning recipe. And it's really a shame because, like I said, I had the Rams in the playoffs this year. I thought they were going to compete a lot with the 49ers this year, but it's just an unfortunate part of the game where, injuries like these ramp up so quickly that it just takes teams like this out of it. And that's why I'm so worried about the Rams now, because they're in a very competitive NFC. The level of competition everywhere is top notch, and being 0-2 already with, having your best players be out for multiple weeks now, it could be a very dire situation for them going forward if they don't get some of these guys back, and if they fall too far behind with how the Cardinals are looking, with how the Seahawks are looking, and we all know who the 49ers are. It could be a situation where it's too little too late when everybody comes back, and that's the unfortunate part about it, and that's why I'm pretty worried about them right now, because of the circumstances around their division and their conference. But, that's my list. Hopefully for the Rams, something finally turns in their favor, but for right now, it's been a nightmare start for them with these injuries. But let me know what you guys think of my list. Also, drop your thoughts as well on anybody that I might have missed as well. So that will do it for this segment of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, on top of following the network on all forms of social media. And if you want to see more of this show, check out both YouTube channels where you find a bunch of variety in how we cover the NFL with YouTube Shorts and individual segment videos as well on there. And also, remember to tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more coverage around the NFL with some of the biggest news and highlights on here with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you for joining me, and I hope to see you guys all back here again with me tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't